yours.
All right, thank you. And I thank everybody for appreciating your time, taking time out of your day to kind of come in, hopefully learn some new information. So yeah, the landscape fire history I'll be talking about, my co-authors are Tom Swetnam and Chris Basin, and I'd like to thank them and kind of the organization that I work for, the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And I'm here out of Flagstaff, so just a little bit of background on that. So just go ahead and get started. A little bit, I think, kind of just to warm up, I like to kind of bring in kind of some of the reasons why I think fire history studies are still important. I know there's been a lot of fire history done, especially in the Southwest, but I think there's still questions that I think that need to be answered. And I think one of the reasons why we need kind of fire history studies is that, you know, as we all know right now, wildfires are kind of a keystone process. I think that, you know, it's inevitable that fires are going to happen, and I think we got to really start seeing, kind of putting these fires that we're seeing today into a historical perspective and seeing how, so that we can kind of see where we want to go in the future with these fires. I think fire history studies in general, I think, are really good and an essential part to educating not only managers on what the fire history in their area was, but I think policymakers and kind of seeing how fire is not all bad and there's different types of fire, so education policymakers. But I think in even greater importance is the need for fire history to inform the general public. I think there's been, for the last 100 years in this fire suppression era, there's been a kind of a negative impact or a negative perspective on fire. And I think the fire history kind of shows us that there's more to that. And there's different kinds of fire, and that historically, before 1900, fire played a very different role. And I think that can kind of shape what we want to go to in the future. And I think that also another important reason is that reintroducing fire into the Southwest landscapes require kind of historical understanding, not only of how fire and climate interact, but also kind of the more kind of landscape level, how does topography interact with these spatial patterns that are historical, and how we can kind of use that information to kind of plan for the future. And so kind of with that, I think there's two real big components in terms of fire history. One is the temporal component, and that, you know, Tom Swetnam and Ben Cord and some of those guys have done tremendous amounts of great studies in terms of kind of quantifying and seeing those patterns in terms of how does climate affect temporal patterns over centuries and decadal scales, multi-centennial scales, and even at interannual scales. And so we can kind of see the temporal variability in that sense. But then I think we can also see the spatial variability that's associated with fire history. And that, of course, is driven by climate at the regional scales, you know. For example, this year there's a great pattern that even within a region there's a great variability. Like this year we have this pattern where from the Utah and northern Arizona to the southeast Arizona and southeast New Mexico, there's gradient. So even within a region the climate can be very variable. But one of the things that I think has gotten a little bit less attention is kind of the spatial variability and how that is related at the landscape level, that is at the mountain range scale, which I think is kind of the scale that most managers on the ground are dealing with. You know, at the district level, how does topography at that scale interact, and how does that affect or affect the landscape fire history patterns? And so that's kind of what the main crux of this topic is going to be. And so there's going to be three parts. The first one is going to be kind of really delving into that relationship between topography and fire history, and that was going to be looking a little bit at a study that we did in the Catalinas. And then there's going to be this, the second part is going to be focusing more at the scale, at the landscape scale, not only of kind of these unique landscapes. For that we're going to go to Rincon Peak and see the fire history there and how that played out. And then I'm going to kind of sprinkle here and there a little bit about the age structure that we've done associated with these fire history studies, and kind of look at the relationship between age structure and fire history patterns. So for the first part, the objective for this first part was to study the relationship between topography and fire history, and look at it in multiple scales. That is, look at it at the stand level, and then look at it at the landscape level, and see which one of those, you know, is the more important one in terms of fire history. So our research questions was, the first one was at the fine scale. We were asking, well, how does the mean fire interval differ between aspect classes? we see that, you know, aspect classes are very important, particularly in the Sky Islands in terms of defining vegetation. We see that a lot of times that we go from one aspect class to the other, and from a north aspect class to a south aspect class, and we see a tremendous change in vegetation. So we know that that vegetation impacts topography impacts vegetation, and it also impacts moisture. But how did that impact historical fire regimes? I think that was one of the basic questions. And then we also wanted to ask how do these mean fire intervals differ not only within the landscape but between landscapes, and how do different landscapes differ in terms of the number of fires? How many? Some landscapes have just more fires than others, and also how did the fire extent differ between landscapes? You know, so did some landscapes have just larger fires compared to others? So that was kind of the multiple research questions that we were trying to address in this first part. And for that, we set up a study site in the Santa Catalina Mountains, just outside of Tucson. There within the Coronado National Forest. And so here we selected two landscapes that we wanted to compare. The two landscapes were actually very different in terms of the topography and kind of the vegetation within each. The Butterfly Peak landscape, which is kind of on the north part of the ridge of the Santa Catalinas, is a more kind of a heterogeneous landscape. It has a lot of different features, and one of its features is these kind of scree slopes or rock outcrops that you see that are unvegetated, so they're actually, you know, deprived of any fuels, and so they're kind of spread out through, you know, scattered throughout the landscape, and so we wanted to see how those impacted the fire history. And then another part of the Butterfly Peak landscape is that since it's a little bit wetter, it has a little more of a mixed conifer component to it, along with some creek bottoms that have some deciduous forest and stuff like that. Whereas the Rose Canyon landscape, I kind of like to think of that as kind of the Flagstaff equivalent, in that it's not exactly flat, but the topography is a little bit a little less diverse, a little more ponderosa pine dominated, although it does have kind of components of mixed conifer spread out throughout in some of those canyons. But for the most part, it's pretty homogeneous ponderosa pine. And so those were the two landscapes that we were looking at within the Catalina Mountains. So when we wanted to stratify both of these landscapes and kind of look at their aspect differences, both to kind of get a feel for the differences in aspect, but also kind of to be able to stratify our sampling according to these aspect classes. So we defined 3 aspect classes, and as you can see from the Rose Canyon, it's mostly a south aspect dominated landscape again, but it also has some of those north aspects kind of scattered around throughout the landscape, whereas the Butterfly Peak is definitely more of a north facing landscape, but it also has components of different types of other aspects. So they both have a diversity of aspects, but they're definitely dominated by one or the other. So we wanted to do this. This work was planned for the May of 2002, but when we were out, and actually we're doing some field work with Calvin Ferris in the Rincons when the bullet fire broke out, which is what you see in the background of this picture. And so the bullet fire in 2002 broke out in the Catalinas, and that kind of postponed a lot of our plans for that year. So we kind of regrouped, and we're planning to do another field season the following year, May of 2000. In the summer of 2003, when the Aspen fire broke out in Tucson in the Catalinas. So essentially, those two fires burned probably a good 95% of the conifer belt in the Catalinas. Despite these two fires, we were able to get out there in 2004 and do the sampling. Again, our sampling was based on a stratified random sampling based on aspects, so we're trying to fit different aspect classes within each one of these two landscapes. And at the plot level, we wanted to really standardize our format for collecting fire history information. So we used a 2-hectare fire history plot. So within a defined area of 2 hectares, we initially looked for all the fire scar material, identified the best pieces that kind of gave us the most information in terms of quality of fire scars and the length of the fire scar record, and then collected anywhere from 4 to 9 fire scar pieces from each of these plots. We also collected vegetation information using kind of smaller 1/10 hectare plots, and some age structure information from these locations too. So here you can kind of see the distribution of those plots within these two landscapes. Again, to the north is the Butterfly Peak landscape, and to the south is the Rose Canyon landscape. And also, one of the things that I try to highlight in this graphic is the gray shaded areas are areas with 35% or 35 degrees or greater slope. So those are kind of those scree slopes, those rock faces that are unvegetated. And so the idea was that these might have an impact on the historical fire spread patterns. So when we looked at within one of the landscapes, the Butterfly Peak landscapes, we're looking at plots that were north-facing aspects and southeast and southwest-facing aspects, and we compared them across aspect classes. We really didn't see a big difference. For the most part, the mean fire interval within these plots, within individual plots, was anywhere from 13 to 15 years. So anywhere from 13 to 15 years, you would see a fire within that time period. That was kind of the recurrent fire interval within at the plot level. But what's interesting is that in terms of variability, the range of these intervals range anywhere from 9 to 29 years. So there was sometimes in some cases really long fire intervals within these plots. But really there was no difference. Although we see some vegetational differences, we really didn't see any fire history differences within the landscape across aspect classes. Kind of the same thing. We found the same pattern in the Rose Canyon area. So whether you were on a south-facing slope or a north-facing slope, the mean fire interval tended to be the same, kind of ranging in the 9 to 10 years between fires. So the fire interval was about every 10 years. The interesting thing here is that in terms of the range of these fires, they tended to be a little more closer to the mean, anywhere from 6 to 12 years. So we didn't see those really long fire intervals in the Rose Canyon area. And so what's interesting here is that even though there's big differences in aspect, there's no difference in the mean fire interval here within a landscape. So then the idea was that we pulled all the plots within Rose Canyon, and then we pulled all the plots within Butterfly Peak, and looked at the two landscapes and were able to compare them. And when we compare between landscapes, we see that that's where the big difference is. The Butterfly Peak area had longer fire intervals, mostly in the 14 to mostly in the 11 to and greater mean fire intervals, so longer fire intervals between fires in Butterfly Peak. Whereas Rose Canyon, at the point level, most of the fire intervals were less than 10 years or less. So there's a big difference between the landscapes in this case. So then the next question becomes, well, why is this difference? Why are we seeing this difference at the point level, at the fine scale? So one of the ideas is that, well, the Rose Canyon could just be having more fires. So one of the things that we were able to kind of do is put together, on the y-axis here, I'm quantifying the number of fire years per 20-year period. So it's kind of a moving average in terms of fire frequency. And we can see that when the record started in about 1755, both landscapes have about 4 fires every 22 years. And then it fluctuates. We get a peak in about 1785 where there's about 6 fires per 20-year period. So it's kind of the peak. And then it comes down to anywhere about 2.5 fires per 20-year period in the mid-1800s, and it kind of stabilizes for a while. But the main point of this is that even though there's fluctuation across time, there's really no difference between the two landscapes. That is, they're experiencing about the same number of fires. So this is nothing about the size of the fires. This is just talking about the number of fires. But when we look at the size of the fires, that's where the big difference, I think, really is. And so what we can see here is that the Rose Canyon area, really the Rose Canyon area was where we see a lot of the fires were bigger fires. So they tended to scar 80% of the 80% or 60% or more of the tree or of the plots. So in terms of area, you can think about it that these were bigger fires spreading across a bigger area in the Rose Canyon. Whereas in the Butterfly Peak area, a lot of the fires tended to be smaller. They tended to be, tended to be kind of spread about 40% of the landscape or smaller. So they're kind of patchier fires in the Butterfly Peak area. So even though there was the same number of fires, they tended to be very different in terms of size. And so here's some of the kind of fire perimeter maps that we were able to reconstruct. So one of the interesting things about the way we did our sampling, and Calvin Ferris has kind of did the same sampling in the Rincon, is kind of put a number of plots across the landscape. And what you're able to do then is you're able to kind of put those plots together and reconstruct the fire perimeter. So as you can see, for example, in the 1785 year, you see that the Rose Canyon landscape within the south, almost the whole the whole landscape burned, but the fire only kind of crept into parts of the Butterfly Peak area. Same thing in 1890. We see that a large portion of the Rose Canyon landscape in the south burned up, but the fire just kind of crept up into parts of the Butterfly Peak landscape. So you see this pattern of bigger fires in the Rose Canyon area, and kind of just creeping into the Butterfly Peak area. And then you see years like 1819 where pretty much both of the study areas burned up. So these are kind of some of the fire patterns that we're able to reconstruct, and I think that's kind of one of the novelties of this study. So then, why is that? Why are the fires bigger in the Rose Canyon area? Is the question. And so one of the obvious answers is vegetation. Maybe the fuels that these fires are burning on is different. And when we looked at some of our vegetation data, we see that both Douglas fir and the Butterfly Peak area is dominated by Douglas fir, kind of a mixture of species, Douglas fir, white fir, ponderosa pine, whereas the Rose Canyon area is dominated primarily by ponderosa pine. So there is a difference in fuels, but this is what we measured in 2004 when we were out there, whereas the fires that we were reconstructing were in the prior to 1900. So one of the things that the age structure analysis kind of is interesting that it shows is that this dominance or kind of mixture of species and more white fir and Douglas fir is actually a recent phenomenon. Historically, if you look at before 1900, it was actually more of ponderosa pine had probably a larger component in the Butterfly Peak area. So this whole idea that this is a mixed conifer stand is a relatively a new phase to the Butterfly Peak. I think historically it was actually more of a ponderosa pine with a little bit of white fir and Doug fir in there. But I think that it has really gone to a mixed conifer forest in the last 100 years. And I think that's kind of the case for a lot of forests, particularly in southern Arizona, and these kind of higher elevation forests that have become mixed conifer forests after fire suppression. Whereas in the Rose Canyon area, you can see that the Rose Canyon area has, for the most part, been a ponderosa pine forest, throughout. So really, the big difference between the two landscapes is the topography. In terms of slope, the Butterfly Peak area has more steeper slopes that are more north facing. And the Rose Canyon area has kind of shallower slopes and more dominated by south-facing slopes. And I think that south-facing slopes is what really probably dried up the fuels quicker and allowed those fires to be bigger in size compared to the Butterfly Peak. And so, just kind of based on that first part, one of the things that we concluded was that the fire regimes tended to vary at large landscape scales, or broader scales, rather than fine, stand level scales, based on our findings. And that another important idea is that these less dissected landscapes, those more homogeneous landscapes like Rose Canyon, tended to experience larger fires that in turn led to shorter fire intervals at the stand level. Those were our conclusions from the first part. So now we're kind of, based on that information that we got from the Catalinas, we kind of wanted to take it a step further and look at not only just dissected or heterogeneous landscapes, but look at at the end of that spectrum. And Tom Swetnam and Chris Basin had done some research, kind of looking at the fire history in the Animas Mountains, and there they found kind of what they define as a mixed fire regime. That is, it kind of tended to have a surface fire regime at some points, and then a standard placing fire regime at other points in time. So, and then Chris Basin had done a fire history in the Mica Mountain and the Rincon Mountains, and in doing that, he had collected some fire interval, some fire scar information from Rincon Peak that showed these really long fire-free periods in the Rincon Peak, but it was only based on like a handful of fire scar samples. So we wanted to kind of reassess that or really kind of intensively sample the Rincon Peaks and kind of really reconstruct the fire regime. And again, look at kind of this relationship between topography and fire history. So the Rincon Peaks, for any of you that are not familiar, they're kind of straight east of Tucson. You can see them, and they're part of the Saguaro National Park. They're a really steep mountain range, really rugged, kind of, and really it's a small pocket of conifer at the top of the peak, and it's surrounded by all kinds of diverse vegetation, including some kind of rock faces that I'll talk about here in a few minutes. So here's kind of the map of the location of the areas that we sampled, and it kind of goes from their number from 1 in the north to 16 and 15 in the south, and that's important because that's kind of how I'll show the fire history graph in a few minutes. And so as you can see from the pictures on the left-hand side, the vegetation is kind of a mixture of these conifer stringers next to these pine or these oak kind of stringers, and so the topography is not very homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous, a mixture of all these vegetation types. So here's the fire history graph for that area. And for those of you that are not familiar, the horizontal lines are the life or the history of each of the plots. And again, a plot here consists of anywhere from 4 to 9 trees. So it's a composite of trees at the plot level. And then the dashed lines represent a fire event. So you can see that there's a lot of variability both in time going across or horizontally, and there's a lot of variability going up and down, and that variability is the spatial variability. So from 1648 to about 1763, all the plots in the Rincon Peak area had what is kind of the typical ponderosa pine fire regime. That is, fires about every 6 to 12 years, very similar to the Rose Canyon area. So frequent fire regimes, probably most likely surface fire regimes. But then in 1763, we see that the fire regime kind of changes. And particularly the plots in the north part of the study area just kind of have this long fire-free interval from 1763 to 1819, and that's very unusual in the Southwest. Typically, you don't see that long of an interval, whereas the plots in the south part of the study area kind of keep burning. And then there's a big fire in 1819, which is kind of a historical. Most of the areas in the Southwest, experienced a fire in 1819. It was one of the drier years in history, and so that was an extensive fire that was recorded throughout the Rincon Peak area. But then the interesting thing that is after that, you don't see another fire that scars more than two plots until 1867. So this is very different from your typical fire regime that you see continuous fires throughout. Here you're seeing these landscape fire-free intervals. And then in 1867, the fires kind of pick up until 1819, which is kind of the beginning of the fire suppression era. So you see that there's a variability in time, and there's also a variability in space. And so, for example, the plots from 20 to 19 here, you see that they actually stopped the recording in about 1867. So you see these plots that were recording surface fire regimes up to a certain point, and then they all start recording. And the reason why they stop recording is because we don't see any more live trees from those plots. So let me show you what those plots look like on the ground. And they're these shrub fields that are dominated by manzanita and oaks. But within these shrub fields, we found these snags, the kind of a remnant forest. And you can see in the snags that you see fire scars in a lot of these snags. And so this is, I think, plot 18, and this is plot 20. Again, if you look at the bottom here of these snags, they're actually fire-scarred trees. So that suggests that this was once a forested system that had a frequent fire regime, and then for some reason it had some kind of event that killed all the trees and kind of converted it to a shrub field. So now if we look at those individual plots that are in the middle of Rincon Peak, and here we're looking at the horizontal lines here are actually trees, not plots. And the dashed lines are individual fires that tree recorded. And so what you can see here is that a lot of the trees that were once recording frequent fires, a lot of these trees died in 1867. So this suggests that they went from a surface fire regime to a stand replacing fire regime, at least in 1867, and there's some evidence that it could have probably happened earlier in 1819 too. So those were the areas that were now these oak fields or shrub fields. But then we also had a couple of plots that were adjacent to these plots, but were in conifer forest, ponderosa pine forest. Yet when we go in there and we sample some of the age structure, we see that it's a forested system. Yet on the ground, there's all these remnants of this one kind of these old trees, and they all kind of died at the same time in 1867. So this is kind of further suggestion that this was a stand replacing fire in 1867. It might have been a similar fires prior to that. So here we see that we have multiple lines of evidence. One line of evidence is this mortality event in 1867. And then this establishment event of a new forest in the 1900s, kind of after the 1893 fire. So we see kind of this mortality event and this new cohort event, which suggests that there was a stand replacing fire at least in 1867 and maybe earlier too in other parts of the landscape. So let me see. So I think in order to be able to kind of really understand what was causing this change from a low severity fire regime to a high or a mixed severity fire regime, we got to look outside of the study area. And in terms of the Rincon Peak on the west side here, this is what it looks like on the west side. And you can see that it's mostly manzanitas with a lot of rocks, scree rock faces that probably served as fire barriers during some times. Same kind of thing stands for on the west face is very steep slopes, and in this case, the vegetation on those little canyons is actually Arizona cypress. On the north end, it's more dominated by pinyon juniper and some manzanita. And on the southern end, it's kind of where you see these shrub fields, and they kind of grade into the pine forest, and then eventually to the pine oak and the oak woodlands kind of. And we think that this is actually where the most of the fires spread into Rincon Peak from the south. As you can see, here we see the shaded areas are these really steep slopes, and you can see that it surrounds the study area that we were looking at. The study area is actually pretty small. It's only 300 acres in size. And so it's kind of only the top of the mountain that really harbors these forests, and on the side of the mountain is these scree slopes with more of a stand replacing fire regime. And I think to really understand the fire regime, we can look at these reconstructed fire maps again, and you can see that 1848 is one of those kind of historic years, and that the whole mountain range burned, and that's one of those years that was really dry, and across the southwest you can see the same pattern. And then, you can see, years where only a small portion of the landscape burned, like in 1691. Again, in 1715, we see a small fire only on the north side. So there's a lot of variability in the fire, kind of the fire pattern. But 1863, again, is the year that everything burns. And that might have been an area that not only everything burned within our study area, but that might have actually created some standard replacement fires within the middle of the study area that actually blocked it off, because we see that in 1775, 1785, 1795, and 1806, we see fires, but none of the fires actually get to the northern part of the study area. So that's what creates that big fire gap in the northern part of the study area. And then we see the 1819 and 1867, but really no fires between those two periods. So I think that within some of these years, particularly 1819, some of the fires that used to come in from the south might have been stopped because of a standard replacing fire in the pinyon juniper kind of created kind of cut off that corridor to the lower elevation ignitions. So in terms of trying to explain that long fire gap, I think we got to look, like I said, we got to look at some of the factors. I think particularly the standard replacing fire component. And I think that that's very important because it actually kind of isolates some of the areas and some of those corridors where fire went through to get to the north part of our study area. And we also got to look at the surrounding landscape and some of those scree slopes and rock faces that probably prohibited a lot of the fires coming up to our study area. And consider that the study area is actually relatively small, and so it actually depends mostly on ignitions from below, from the lower elevations, rather than ignitions from lightning. So this whole idea of a mixed fire regime has been kind of documented in other areas. Like I said before, in the Animas Mountains, I think Zion National, some areas in Zion have kind of seen this kind of fire regime. And I think they all kind of have some commonalities. One of them is that they all occur in these complex areas, very rugged topography, relatively small forested areas that are surrounded by fire barriers. But another interesting factor is that they all kind of happen during the same time period, that is the late 1800s to early 1900s transitional period. This is a very interesting time in the climate area because the El Nino La Nina kind of switches and it becomes less intense during that time period. So they suggest that even though they relate there's some commonalities in terms of physical factors, there's also the climate is actually playing is being the catalyst that kind of transforms these fire regimes. So just little switches in climate change, little switches in climate cause a big impact in terms of the fire regime in these smaller, kind of more vulnerable mountain ranges. And just to close out, I'd like to add some of the interesting findings that we were able to do looking at the age structure, kind of looking at not the age structure of the contemporary forest, but more the historical forest, and looking at the age structure in Rincon Peak in the north part. If you may remember, that part of the Rincon Peak had two long fire intervals, one between 1763 and 1819, and we see that during that kind of fire hiatus period, we do see a kind of a new cohort being established, and another cohort after the 1919 fire kind of being established during that long fire-free period. As you may recall, the Rincon Peak South, we only see one of these fire intervals, from 1819 to 1875, and when we look at that age structure, that's where we see the age structure, the age peak kind of occurring in that 1819 to 1867 period. So that suggests that there's a tight relationship between the age structure, those age peaks, and the fire activity, particularly the fire-free period, that the trees like to take advantage of those fire-free periods to really develop some of those fire characteristics and grow to a height that they can survive the fires. So there's an interesting relationship there between fire and age structure. And I think with that, I'll open it up and answer any questions that you might have. Oh, actually, I have the last slide here. So let me just, in terms of the management implication, I think the Coronado especially has really kind of taken this idea of the relationship between topography and fire history patterns and incorporated it into what the Firescape program, and this idea that we can kind of separate areas based on topography and kind of start defining these fireshed areas, kind of these landscapes that had similar fire patterns in the past, and we can kind of manage those differently. In terms of the mixed fire regime, I think that is actually very analogous to some of the stuff that we're seeing now, because a lot of the fires that we're seeing now, of course, have a big stand replacing fire component, and those stand replacing fire components, those patches that are stand replacing fire, are going to start breaking up the fuels. So even in these surface fire regimes that were once surface fire regimes, it's going to be hard to restore big fires because now they're kind of broken up by these stand replacing fire regimes. So I think that the lessons we learn from Rincon Peak are going to be important in kind of managing these burned up landscapes that we're seeing, due to these new fires, these mega fires. And I think in terms of age structure, the age structure fire interval relationship really kind of points to this idea that we can use fire as a silvicultural tool in terms of when we want to allow these cohorts to exist and when we want to thin out the forest using fire. And I think that the timing of the fire is very important, and these maintenance burns can be an important tool in terms of connecting fire managers and silviculturists and kind of marrying those two disciplines together and kind of using the fire as a tool, as a silvicultural tool. So, and I think that was my last slide.
Okay, thanks, Pepe. That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure there are going to be some questions. So I'm going to unmute the line, and then we can start grabbing some questions from everyone on the phone. So it's always a little difficult to get questions from the crowd on the phone. So feel free to just sort of shout them out, and we'll try to take them in some sort of order, or you can type them in the chat box if you prefer.
Pepe, this is Don Swan at Soar National Park. The great presentation. Thanks. I really enjoyed it, and I'm familiar with your dissertation. Do we know anything about the fires outside of your study area on Rincon Peak, just in terms of return intervals? Is there, there are some other patches, forested patches, kind of down slope from that area. Has there been, has Tom done any work, or anyone else done any work to know a little bit more about the surrounding area?
Well, Calvin Ferris did his work on Mica Mountain, and then I did my work on Rincon Peak. But there is, what is that called, the little saddle there? Happy Valley?
Happy Valley Saddle,
Happy Valley Saddle. And that's kind of that's the missing link, I think, right now. And that's because, as you know, that's a really weird little patch of forest. It's like at 4,000 feet or something. And so I think that right now, me and Calvin haven't really kind of tried to combine the two data sets and in terms of trying to see how many fires that you saw in Mica, you saw in Rincon Peak. But that would really give us a good sense of which fires really burned the whole entire mountain range and which fires were more isolated. Because as you know, there's some areas that, like some of those shrub slopes, the manzanita, the juniper, that we really can't reconstruct the fire history for. So the best we can do is kind of look at the fire history from adjacent areas and kind of surround those areas. And I think that we've done a pretty good job in the Rincons of doing that. And so I think we can kind of start at least making some educated guesses at what the fire intervals were between those areas too. But actually we haven't really done that right now yet.
Yeah, we'd be interested in working with you on that.
Okay, yeah, that would be good. And I think that because Chris Basin has always talked about looking at that Happy Valley, because we did find some fire scarred trees in that Happy Valley area, but it's just such a kind of an oasis of forest there that is kind of, we didn't want to kind of put you guys on the spot to ask you to collect some fire scars from there, but I think that's kind of the missing link right now.
Good. Let's talk about that. And then if I have time for a follow-up question. So one of the concerns that we have about another stand replacing fire on Rincon Peak would be just kind of watershed processes and downstream effects and things like that. And do you have any just kind of thoughts or recommendations about how the park should be managing fire in that part of the park on Rincon Peak? Both short-term and long-term. Do you have any thoughts at all? I know, not to put you on the spot about that, but it's certainly something that we're asking ourselves.
Yeah, I think, I talked to I think that actually particularly the south side of Rincon Peak, that south end, actually had a fire in the 80s, and actually that area looks pretty good. And I think Chris Basin and I really talked about it, and trying to really emphasize that as kind of the starting point to kind of restoring fire in Rincon Peak. You know, trying to get that area to where it can be less vulnerable to a standard replacing fire, and then just kind of working out from there. But I think, like anything, I think, you know, small steps at the beginning is probably a good way to go. But in terms of, but I think at the other end is that I think, if anything, this kind of stuff has shown us that standard replacing fires were a part of the system, and I think that, you know, in terms of some of those oaks, I think that they're pretty resilient to standard replacing fire. They seem to resprout really well, and so I think we have to acknowledge that a standard replacing fire is going to be part of restoring a fire regime there. To what extent and what's the size of those patches? I think that's kind of the big question. And I think for that, I think, and now that you have so many people kind of downstream from that, I think that a cautionary way to go about it in terms of smaller, at the beginning at least, smaller burn sizes would probably be the best way to go.
Yeah, great, good. Well, we'll talk some more. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Other questions?
Hebby, this is Craig Wilcox from the Coronado.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Hey, I was wondering if you had any, if your studies showed any anthropomorphic impacts from the Native Americans perhaps burning some of those areas that where fires might not be tied to climate so much.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think the whole idea of human ignition, I think, you know, you're probably familiar with the whole idea that it wasn't really that this area was not kind of fire ignition limited. You know what I mean? There was plenty of lightning to start these fires. But the interesting thing about talking to people from Saguaro, is that actually that Rincon Peak, to them, they're actually amazed at how little Rincon Peak, how few lightning ignitions it gets. And so I think that it probably a lot of the fires that probably might have been started by Native Americans in the lower elevations probably did climb up all the way to the top of the peak. But some of the smaller ones, I mean, I think, I mean, I got to be honest that your guess is as good as mine in terms of the impact over on the higher elevations. But the one thing about Rincon Peak is that it doesn't have that much water, and so I kind of have a feeling that the Native American presence at the top of the peak at least was pretty limited, just because of the lack of water. But yeah.
Thanks.
No problem. Thank you.
Other questions out there?
Well, I mean, I guess maybe I always do this, but I see that Mary Lara is on the line.
That's right.
Yeah, and I was wondering. So I've heard that the Forefry Collaborative is using some of those fire escape ideas to kind of. And so I was wondering how are you guys using that information, or kind of how do you guys view the fire escape idea?
Well, the fire escapes as they were designed were by our stakeholder group, and it was set largely as a way of defining, well, our big area was a couple million acres, and then that was broken up so that each fire escape theoretically could contain an entire large fire. Of course, Wallow blew that right out again. But it was set more on things that would be barriers to fires, so that, say, an interstate or a bridge or something that would be either a place you could potentially stop a fire or an area that naturally would stop a fire. It wasn't so much based on the ecology of it.
Yeah. No, but I think that in a way it's kind of like fire sheds, what the historical fire shed was and what the current fire shed can be are two different things. But I think in the sense they're almost they're kind of the same idea. Like we want to manage fire in a certain way in this area is the idea, I guess. Yeah.
Right. They're manageable areas both from the mechanical treatments and from whatever we might be able to do with allowing fire to burn once we get things back where they belong, or applying prescribed fires. They're fairly logical divisions. It's very similar to what the forest had set up before Forefry came in already.
Okay. Thanks.
So Jill Rundle has just typed in a question or a comment rather, and she says that she might add that fire escapes at the Forefry were also defined by past fire footprints and prevailing winds.
Oh, yeah. And I think that actually, and that's one of the things and me and Tom Swetnam and some of the guys from the Tree Lab have been talking about lately about that whole idea of the prevailing winds. And it seems like, and one of the things I was looking around Flagstaff is that you can go back to the 1940s. There was a fire in 1948, kind of I think it was called the A1 fire, kind of around A1 around Flagstaff. And you can, when you put the fire perimeter to an aerial photo, you can actually see that it torched out in 1948, and it was that kind of southwest to northeast pattern. And I think that's probably so we were talking about, like, if we thought that was how the way historical fires kind of spread, and some of that suggests that it did. But then on the other hand, when you look at the Miller fire in the Gila this year, it was more of what we would kind of define as a historical kind of natural fire in Ponderosa Pine. And that one, it kind of had some runs that were, southwest to northeast. For the most part, it kind of just spread as a big blob. And so that's kind of the fires that we see now, I think, might be a little bit different, because now they're in terms of their severity, the runs that they make are pretty big, but then how they spread as a surface fire is very different too. So yeah. Yeah,
that's a real interesting point. That when we had the low intensity, low severity fires, they would have been affected by topography and the wind quite differently than the ones that turn into these roaring monster fires.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, if you see the Wallow fire, I think some of those high severity patches have that northeast to southwest kind of pattern, but in general, it tended to kind of spread, more north and kind of more laterally when it kind of died down too. So, yeah. Huh. So I see that about the Warren fire, but so the Warren fire made its big run southward, right? Yeah. Okay. So that was a wind-driven event.
Yeah, from what I understand, it was, and it also was a transition from the PJ up into the higher elevation.
So it kind of ran downhill, is what?
No, it ran uphill. It went off. It kind of curved around down off the plateau and then ran up the hill from the PJ with basically the downburst from the passing storm. But someone who was actually there might know more.
Oh. Yeah, I think I think in terms of looking at fire history, I think that we got enough fires from the last 2 decades to start, looking at these patterns a little more closely. I think, yeah. And I think Tom Swetnam and Mike Crimmins and some of those guys down in Tucson are kind of looking at that, at kind of like the jet stream positioning and how that has influenced some of these big fire runs, Because I mean, like, you know, like, wow, the Schultz fire in Flagstaff was a prime example of that. You know, I mean, it made its big run on one day, and that day was, you know, just wind driven. So I mean, I promised I wouldn't say this, but I think the Southwest Consortium and others are thinking about doing a fall trip, road trip to kind of see some of these fires. So keep your eyes open, and we can kind of talk about these things on the ground. I think in the next couple of months, maybe in the fall.
And Pepe, this is Mary again. If you want to do another dissertation, it'd be interesting to look at the difference in the fire shapes, the scars on the landscape as the types of fires changed.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's something that we were talking about in terms of kind of with the idea there was that, you know, we might have seen these kind of torching out in the 40s, kind of like long linear fires, and now they're just getting kind of wider, you know. So in the 1940s, when conditions were not as dense, the runs were a little bit smaller, and now that things are so dense, or maybe it's climate change, but so for some reason the fires are making bigger runs, I guess is the idea. But I think yeah, and I think another idea that we're kind of kicking around is I think that this year is a particularly great example in terms of kind of using fire as a restoration tool. If you see that some of the fire severity maps from the Miller fire in the Gila, I mean, I think it was less than 1% high severity, and I think the Chiricahua, the fire in the Chiricahua is in the 9%, and the Wallow fire is in the 15%. And so in terms of there's a gradient there of fire severity patches, and there's a gradient there in terms of the area that those fires have burned, that reburns. You know, so in the Gila they're burning for the fourth and fifth time, and the Chiricahua they're burning for the second time, and in the Wallow they're burning for the first time. So. But that says a lot about kind of using these old fires, you know, these at least old in the last 50 years, as kind of as a start for the fire program. And that's what Sahuaro kind of, that's how they started their fire program, I believe, is kind of using some of those fires to really start a prescribed fire program, and the same with the Gila. So I think that can be said for the Coronado, for the Chiricahuas, and maybe for the Wallow fire now. And effectively, these fires have treated the landscape.
I just wanted to give you a heads up since you were
Woohoo!
Well, and maybe that's a reasonable place to sort of close off this webinar.
It was great.
I think there's some good opportunities that we'll discuss in more detail for the fall. And if anybody on this call has ideas about how we could frame conversations or set up a useful dialogue or discussion about some of the fires this year, definitely get in touch with me or anybody else involved in the Southwest Fire Consortium, because obviously it'll be a while before the final reports are out, but I think there's a lot of interest, and so trying to identify a reasonable way in the short term to have some of these conversations is a good idea. So Pepe, I want to thank you again. Really good presentation. Obviously opened up a lot of key topics that we're all interested in, and this presentation will be available as a recording for folks to share. And when I close out this, you'll be sent to a quick little survey about how you like the topic and the webinar, et cetera. And I'd really encourage folks to fill that out. It shouldn't take too long. So with that, I'm going to close off the line and close down the webinar. And thanks everybody again.
Thank you. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Pepe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually, I didn't see. Might be above one of the